All right, well, hello everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm going to be talking about avoiding a $1 billion IBM security disaster. My name is Robin Tatum. I'm the Director of Security Technologies here at Help Systems, and it's certainly my pleasure to be able to speak to you today. I do have some contact information up on the slide. You're welcome to leverage that, either email or Twitter. You can always reach me through those channels, regardless of where I happen to have landed in the world. My background is almost exclusively IBM, so I am certainly someone who works in this space day in and day out. I've probably done just about every job there is to do on this platform, but for the last 15, 17 years or so, focused almost exclusively in security and compliance. I am a certified information security manager with ISACA, and I'm also this year one of the IBM Champions, which was very exciting to be chosen as part of that program. It's also my honor to share the stage here today with one of my fantastic colleagues here at Health Systems. Sandi, I know you were on the audio just now, but why don't you say hi to everybody and let them know what your kind of focus is here at Health Systems.
Hi, everybody. Sandi Moore here. Thank you, Robin, for that introduction. I've actually been working on IBM platform for about 16 years, coming up on 17, working in all sorts of roles with customers, also on the backside in support roles. But really what I enjoy the most is working with security and sharing with people what I've learned and hopefully expanding that knowledge out there for everybody.
And I know you do a lot of our security scans for us. We're going to talk about that towards the end of today and help you understand what that is and how you sign up for it. So we say $1 billion. That's a pretty big stretch of imagination. I think many of us are used to the idea that there can be money or is money associated with data disasters or servers being down, but $1 billion is a pretty big number. How do we get to that, right? And I think for a lot of us, it's really starting to become a matter of regulatory oversight. So GDPR, which is a regulation that was introduced into the European Union in May of 2018, when it became actually law and was enacted, that introduced a completely different fine structure for non-compliance or for data breaches than we have ever seen before. There is potential of an organization being fined up to 20 million euros. Certainly that's not getting us to the $1 billion mark, but there is also the option of 4% of annual gross revenue for the prior year being levied as well, or whichever is greater, not smaller. And at that point, when we start to see organizations like Facebook and Google and Orange, which is a telecom company over there, that have been breached, that we get to see the potential of these fines really reaching into that new $1 billion arena, which is quite startling and definitely something that ideally we want to avoid. Now up here, I've got a remark that these regulations and frameworks are going to save us from this $1 billion disaster. Reality is it's kind of a mixed blessing because, like I said, we're actually seeing the potential of these $1 billion costs based on these regulations. So how is that helping us? Well, the idea behind the regulations, of course, is that we are complying with some type of baseline that is giving us good practices. So rather than everybody being required to or just voluntarily setting up their security correctly, then we have this idea that we have a baseline that we have to comply with in order to ensure that we're at least doing the minimum things. Now, there's a ton of these different regulations depending on what industry you're in or what part of the world you live in, and many of them are built upon some pretty standard frameworks. I've listed COBIT, ISO, and ITIL here. There are others. NIST is another example. So these frameworks are designed to kind of identify those best practices, and then the regulations leverage the work that's been done in those frameworks to indicate the type of compliance that needs to be done. So these are all helpful, but we have to understand that the regulations typically are not the end game. They're just telling us if we're not going to take care of this ourselves, then this is in essence what we have to do. And this is where we start to run into a pain point. Most of us don't deal with regulations and regulatory people. We're IT folks. And so we end up with this challenge of translation, right? And Sandi, I know, in your work and working with customers, when we talk about some of these regulations, this is something that I'm sure you see as well.
Absolutely. And what they've come up with in the framework is terminology and technology that doesn't necessarily match up with the world that we all live in. And so sometimes the translation of these concepts doesn't come through. So what we really want to do is try to start translating this into things that actually make sense to us and that apply to the IBMI and what we work with every day, and
Absolutely.
try to get to that point.
Yep. So the idea that this terminology doesn't match potentially technology is certainly one layer, but a second layer beyond that is that we may even have differences at an IBMI level, because we all know that when a Windows auditor comes in and wants to look at an IBMI, they're really not sure how to deal with this thing. So I thought I'd paint just a simple picture here. It can be a translation thing. In English, we have an apple. In French, we have pomme. It's the same thing, right? So we can translate that relatively easily, because as long as we have kind of an English-French dictionary, we can look to see what the equivalent is. But then when we introduce perhaps another concept, which is more definition-based, that's where we start to get into trouble. So not only do we have this translation, but we have the idea that perhaps a regulation is speaking in generic terms. In this case, maybe we're talking about fruit, which encompasses a lot of different items that could be considered fruit. And so we're not really sure which item is being discussed. And that's probably the bigger part of where we have this disconnect between compliance and audit staff, and then the technology implementers that are in charge of managing the systems and ensuring they're configured correctly. We also have the pain point that we don't necessarily know in that definition with something like PCI, for example, that, like most regulations, talks about oversight and management of powerful or privileged user accounts. But under IBMI, there's no definition per se that says that user is powerful. So we have to now figure out, what does that mean and what does that mean to the regulation before we can determine how many of those types of users we have and how best to manage their activities. For me, there's a responsibility triangle at play here when it comes to setting up any kind of security or compliance program under IBMI. So first of all, we have IBM, who has written and supplies the operating system. It was their responsibility to give us an OS that had the necessary controls contained within it that could be correctly configured to make us secure. And they did a pretty darn good job at that. We also then have software vendors who have to leverage those controls when they create their applications to make sure that the permissions are set correctly and the directives that they give their customers are appropriate to the types of permissions that their user base should be given. And then ultimately, it's us or you, based on the ownership of that server, to ensure that we're buying the right software, we're leveraging the tools, and that we have the actual server itself set up. One of the disconnects here tends to be that software vendors think to themselves, well, we're not necessarily the only application that's running on the system, so we are not in a position to be able to dictate to the software owners, the people that have purchased it, exactly what that is. Okay, so we have to recognize that we have some responsibility there in pushing the vendors in the right direction, but tying all of this together. Unfortunately, we do have a bit of a problem in that most IBMI operating system server configurations are unconfigured. The default state of security under IBMI is to allow all, and we don't often change that. We also know that software vendors don't typically understand how those controls work. They see their job as giving you the software, and it's up to you to then configure the security according to how the software is going to be used. But we've assumed that the software vendors are doing it, or that IBM inherently makes that application secure, and so we ignore the whole problem. And so we have this complete disconnect here, even though it is actually a good configured state. Now, how do I know this? Well, one of my fantastic responsibilities here at Health Systems is to put together the State of IBM Security Study each year. And that's a task, it's a labor of love that I do actually enjoy doing because it gives us really unique insight into what people are doing and, just as importantly, what they're not doing when it comes to their IBM security configuration. And what it leads us to know is that the IBM server is indeed very securable, but it is not inherently secure. So we have to recognize that it does take action, no different from any other operating system that we're probably dealing with, whether on a desktop or on another server, except we have the ability built in to configure many of these controls. We just simply have not taken it to the necessary level. There are some things we're actually very good at. Physical security, I've noticed over the last few years, has become more intensive around the world. When I go on a customer visit and we enter the building, oftentimes we're required to have our photograph taken. We're given an ID badge for the period of the visit. We have to show our driver's licenses or leave that at the front desk. And there's gates at the door. So there are all kinds of things that are having us sign in and track our movement around the office. And that's fantastic. We also know that there tends to be a fair amount of perimeter security from an electronic perspective. Firewalls are pretty common. I say pretty common because despite the fact that I think we all understand that conceptually you should never run without a firewall, I still do come across people that do. Blows my mind. But this technology is pretty mature at this point. It's not infallible, and that's something that I'll mention again a little bit later, but certainly the technology to ensure that a perimeter is protected is really something that for the most part we've got a pretty good handle on. So what we end up with, however, then is what I call the M&M defense. And that means that we have, in essence, a security layer that is pretty crunchy on the outside. But if we get through that, if we bite into it, we find that it is milky chocolate inside. And that's very similar to how most of us have our security configured. We have the firewall protecting the perimeter, but if somebody is inside the firewall, either by design or by penetrating that perimeter, it's not as challenging for them to navigate around and access areas of the system that perhaps we're not expecting them to be. What I prefer is this nesting or Russian doll approach, whereby we have different layers and we can apply more layers to those areas of the network that are deemed perhaps prone to attack, or that they contain sensitive information, so that we can apply the appropriate levels of control based on the need to protect. Right? So perhaps IBM as an enterprise server serving up your ERP application, we don't necessarily want that to be wide open just because somebody is on the network. A team at IBM is known as X-Force, which is a really cool name. I'd love to have something like that. But this team does a nice job of documenting data breaches. And they do so on an ongoing basis through this scatter diagram. And this is telling us in a couple of different ways the types of attacks that are occurring and the size of those attacks. So there are incidences here. And to me, I certainly see a pretty dominant purple color here, which is reporting to us that it's simple misconfiguration. So one of the most common causes of data breaches and the most common types of attacks occur simply because we're not setting things up correctly. Now, we also can tell from the size of the dots the size of the attack. And what I also find interesting here is the second most dominant type of attack is the other category, or undisclosed category, which I would offer probably consists of a large amount of misconfiguration. So when we talk about that, what we recognize then is that there is a pretty dominant ability for us to avoid the types of attacks that we're suffering from simply by setting things up correctly. Now, I've mentioned firewall. That's a pretty common discussion point for many organizations when we talk about the types of protection that we expect to see and hope to have implemented. But it's important to recognize that the recent Capital One breach that occurred in 2019 was certainly partly due to the fact that a firewall had been misconfigured, and somebody who was very knowledgeable about the cloud environment the Capital One was using was able to penetrate and extract data. Right. So thought I'd leave you just with a slightly tongue-in-cheek comic here that tells us that we can't rely simply on one security layer, because when it does get breached, we find that there is potential of certainly devastating impact. And this is a breach that so far is going to impact about 100 million U.S. residents, and certainly a number of Canadian residents as well. So Sandi, what I think we should do is to leverage some of the knowledge we have of how the compliance regulations are worded and written, and to talk about some of the confusion that we tend to see, especially in IBMI shops who are just not used to dealing with it.
Absolutely. Why don't we talk about policy definition first? And what does that mean? What are our IBMI people supposed to know about this?
Well, policy is definitely an interesting one, right? Because we're familiar with having policies around disaster recovery and role swaps and in other things, but it's surprising how many people still, even in this day and age, don't have any type of security policy. So that's what most regulations are looking for, is some written type of definition that when an auditor comes in the door, that they can compare your existing infrastructure to the anticipated infrastructure documented in the policy, right? So as an auditor, my job in the perfect world is not to come in and look at your system per se for the first time. What it's doing is just comparing your current system against the policy, or validating that you're doing that job in an even better scenario, right? Because if I come into a shop once a year, I don't want people scrambling a couple days beforehand going, hey, we have to make sure everything's set correctly, because that means there's 360 odd days that I'm not there that people are not doing this, and that's definitely going to be beneficial. So we want a policy that is going to be multi-layered or tiered based on different types of business activities or geographies that are covered. We want to build it over a known framework. I mentioned some of the frameworks earlier, so don't reinvent the wheel. Leverage what's out there already, but it has to be a fluid type of document. You can't have a document from 1993 and expect that it's still current as of 2019, because the world is a very, very different place. As I mentioned, we as auditors are coming in to really check that your settings of value are against your policy, or that you're checking that. And if you don't have a policy in which to do that, understand that an auditor is going to bring in their own, and it's going to be based on a framework. And if you think it's difficult to comply with a policy at all, imagine trying to comply with a policy that you have never even seen before.
Well, firewall protection seems pretty straightforward. We've talked about firewall already, and that's one of the most common things in place. But how does it apply when we're actually talking about the audits?
Well, in the regulations, firewalls are pretty much a given, right? Because we know that that perimeter protection is necessary. And we've seen some pretty intense examples where outside penetration has caused some significant issues. So we don't want to assume, first of all, that a firewall is impenetrable. Capital One learned that the hard way. We also have to know that IBMI actually has some of this capability built into it. I had a conversation yesterday with a customer and explained, unbeknownst to them, that there was an IDS system built into the operating system. The reason most people don't know that and don't use it is because they assume that the perimeter firewall is sufficient. And perhaps it is for them. But my point is, if the operating system has this capability and you just simply have to turn it on, why not? It just becomes another layer of protection that provides, the immunity of IBMI from either other activities that are happening on the network, right? We tend to talk also about exit programs when we're in the firewall category under IBMI. If you're not familiar with exit programs, certainly that's information we can provide, because they are very important in the overall security schema. But most auditors don't know about exit programs, and so they're not going to be checking your system or asking you about the existence of these exit programs, and that could leave you exposed without you realizing it. And we want to make sure that under the firewall protection that we're not allowing users, including those service accounts and the dormant accounts that we all have, to do more than is necessary. Because if one of those profiles is leveraged in order to get onto the system, do we want it to be the minimal amount of permission that that profile needs in order to operate, or do we want it to be a security officer, right? Because we've got to remember, if somebody comes in from outside, they don't come in anonymously, they come in as someone. And so we want our user community to have the appropriate levels of permission.
All right, so this one's actually confusing for me. Network segmentation, how does that apply to IBMI, and do we need to worry about it?
Well, we certainly do need to worry about it. Network segmentation really speaks to the idea that we have different servers and different roles and different layers of the network, so that by getting onto the network, it's not just one common place that we can get to. Now, under IBMI, we tend to be a little bit of an island, right? But how many of us now are using separate LPARs or just different frames to do different roles, whether it's a production system, a test system, a development system? And especially with people that perhaps are hosting applications for their customers, we still see people that are segmenting the application based simply on a different library for the database. Now, IBMI has fantastic security controls. It allows us to set permissions that are segmented by library. So it's not necessarily a problem that we see that, but when we talk about true network segmentation, it's going to be more common that we would expect and desire to see a separate LPAR. Same thing with web applications. We're seeing a lot of open source development, a lot of web applications that are leveraging IBMI DB2 data. So we typically don't want the web application server running on the same server as the application itself. So the web side of it perhaps is out in a DMZ, it's talking to a hosting LPAR, and all of this can be done very easily now. IBMI can be set up with almost micro partitions in very quick and timely manner. So definitely something that we would recommend under IBMI. But the bottom line in all of this, Sandy, is we have to recognize that when we're hacked or if we're attacked, 5250 or green screen is probably the least likely methodology that a hacker is going to use, because most likely they don't even know what kind of server this is. They're going to use those standard industry protocols that exist in every OS, not downloading an emulator and trying to hack a green screen.
Makes sense. All right, so how about server hardening? How do we apply that to IBMI?
Server hardening is always interesting because you see a lot of regulations that just kind of generalize the security discussion into saying have good security, right? But they don't tell us what that means at a technology level, and they certainly don't tell us what that means under IBMI. So we have to interpret that as best we can. And that's usually done to a certain extent with the assistance of somebody that knows security and understands the nuances of the Power Platform. So a couple of ideas here: making sure that the controls are correctly configured. That's really what it comes down to. That's going to be a combination of system values, user profile attributes, object permissions, public authorities, things like that, that are part of that IBM supplied infrastructure that I mentioned a little bit earlier when I talked about the triangle of responsibility. We certainly recognize that we don't want to deploy an IBMI server or any other server for that matter in its default shipped state, because as I mentioned, IBMI is in an allow all configuration when you first power it up. And it's our responsibility by leveraging applications and doing the correct steps to make sure that that is changed into what we refer to and what many regulations require as a deny all state, right? Now, having our security policy is beneficial here, again, because now we can rule by exception. If we know that we're supposed to be at security level 40 and that's documented, we can check that system value on a recurring basis to make sure that it is indeed set correctly. And by highlighting just the exceptions, we have a much more manageable task on our hands. And as I mentioned, if you're not comfortable with determining what hardening means and whether you are currently in a hardened state, then I would recommend hiring a professional in order to assist you with that. Because let's face it, you don't know what you don't know, and it's better sometimes to have somebody that does this for a living.
So event auditing, that actually seems to be pretty self-explanatory, but I think that sometimes this is also misunderstood.
Well, I think people understand the intent, right? But the implementation of it is where we tend to see people running into some challenges. So when I read a regulation, and this is pretty much common across every regulation on the books, no matter where in the world you live, the idea that we have to know what is happening on our server. So from an IBMI perspective, that means turning the audit function on. And if you say to yourself, what audit function is Robin talking about? You have to recognize that this is one of the built-in capabilities of the OS. However, we still see more than 10% of systems that we look at without any of this functionality even running. So if somebody was knocking on the door without permission and the system was saying, don't think you should be here, there's no log of that for us to ever know that that's occurring, right? So we want to make sure that we turn the audit functions on. But with that being said, we want to make sure we turn it on properly, because the default configuration is not an ideal one. It wants to place the data into a library called QGPL, which is a very noise-filled library and not a place that I think important information like audit logs should be stored. We also want to consider whether we're going to be looking at that log repository and doing so proactively. If you've ever done a review of the audit journal entries, you've probably been overwhelmed by the number of entries and how kind of not difficult to interpret, but how you have to parse it out or look at multiple files. So sometimes what we tend to see nowadays is people leveraging a specific type of monitoring tool. We tend to refer to those as syslog servers or SIM solutions. And those allow us to do real-time type warnings. So you can even aggregate logs from different disparate platforms and say, look, if this had happened just on one platform by itself, probably no big deal. But when we see it cascade across the entire server infrastructure, now it's a problem. And a SIM does a great job at that. And we can tie IBMI into those SIMs very easily. We also tend to have a lot of privileged users under IBMI, and we want to make sure that those users are monitored and that any access to sensitive objects is audited. Again, all functions that can be done in the operating system. When it comes to the audit, I've mentioned that we don't always have it configured correctly. We also don't tend to keep it the right amount of time. Most regulations will speak to how much data you have to keep. 90 days, 365 days. These are all good examples of how long this data should exist. Now, bear in mind, an insider breach tends to take about 18 months to fully diagnose. So if you're purging your audit data the next day after you collect it, which many shops do thanks to the HA applications on their server, then we have to recognize that we're going to fall short of ever being able to look back, because the log will have been cleared far too quickly, right? So we want to make sure that there is a perpetual log being placed somewhere that's available.
Data encryption is something that's near and dear to my heart. And, you know, some of the confusion is what encryption is going to be appropriate. And I think that they're not all created equal either.
They are absolutely not all created equal. I had the honor of being one of the authors of the Encryption Redbook for IBMI a number of years ago. And this was back when it was very manually intensive. You had to restructure the database. You had to embed API calls into your applications, which meant if you didn't have the source code, your hands were kind of tied. And it was really designed to assist software vendors embedding encryption functions for their customers. It wasn't an end user function. That's changed over time. There are capabilities now under IBMI. A field procedure or field proc is a term that we use now that is very beneficial to us in the encryption space. But from a bottom line perspective, encryption is extremely beneficial. A lot of regulations now are demanding this. PCI, GDPR all have comments about encryption and requirements for encryption, because the idea is we're not hiding the fact that data exists. We're just making it so it's not humanly readable. And if there is an instance where the data is accessed without permission, recognizing that most likely that is going to happen, we at least have the reassurance that a human being couldn't interpret the data and actually make use of it. In that case, GDPR actually gives us a bit of a get out of jail free card, that we don't necessarily have the same notification requirements if encrypted data is breached versus non-encrypted data. Now, you mentioned that there's different ways to do this, and they're not all created equal. Full disk encryption is an option under IBMI, but you want to be very careful about what that does for you, because it's non-conditional, meaning that it doesn't matter if you're the authorized user or the unauthorized user, whether you're using RPG, query, COBOL, some type of PC data extract tool like FTP. all of these things are going to grab the data and the disk automatically decrypts it, which kind of defeats the purpose of it. So we want to understand the pros and the cons to each approach, but the commonality is that we want to use industry standard protocols and good key strengths. So currently, the US government standard is an AES encryption algorithm, and we want to see at least 128-bit keys or longer. 256 is ideal. And we want to focus our attention on data that is sensitive. A lot of people say, well, I'm just going to encrypt everything. And that's why disk encryption is so appealing. They don't really have to do any work. The problem with that is it means a lot of initial setup, or that you're not getting the value out of encryption that you think you are. So this is a great topic. It's definitely something that IBMI does and does very well, but it's a conversation we probably need to have so you can understand the different approaches and the benefits and the disadvantages to each of those so that you can settle on the right answer for you.
Oh, antivirus. Yeah. So with antivirus, I think, and you're going to help us with this one, Robin, this is a box that everybody seems to just skip over because of some misunderstandings here too.
Well, it's a quick topic, right? Because you can't get a virus on IBMI. Okay, I'm smiling here when I say that, and the reason being, I do still hear people say that, and it's a common misperception about IBMI is that we are immune utterly from the infection and impact of viruses. But IBM actually, back in version 5 of the operating system, put antivirus functionality into the operating system. And my question is, why would they have done that if there was no possibility of getting a virus? So understand a few nuances here. It is possible to host any kind of virus on IBMI. So if you're thinking somebody's sitting there writing viruses specifically for the OS, no, they can host a Windows virus. So it's the same type of infection because we have what's called the integrated file system, or IFS. Right? And those file systems under the IFS, other than QSys.lib and a few others, often can host those Windows files, and they're just as infected in our environment as they would be under Windows. Nothing's magically cleansed just because you copy it through a drive share. Now, a lot of people have come to recognize that we can host a virus, but they still believe that we are immune from any interruption natively on our side. So what we have to recognize is that's where this misnomer comes from originally, is that we won't be infected under a native object. So you won't see a virus embed itself in a physical file or an RPG program. That's the good news. It does not mean, however, that those objects can't be affected, right? Because if we have malware or some type of virus that is attempting to rename or delete, these are valid operations under any of the file systems. And if a user profile that is used to connect to the system is used by a virus and it has sufficient permissions, such as the all-common all-object permission, then it's very, very feasible that the operating system and your native applications could be damaged. And we have to recognize that even if you're doing HA, and you think, well, that's okay, I'll just roll swap to my other machine, recognize that HA doesn't say, wait a minute, that's a viral activity. It just simply says you want the other machine to look like the first one. So any damage done to your primary is instantly replicated to your backup machine. So that's not necessarily the answer, right? So we have this infrastructure added in version 5, but what we're lacking is the engine to do the scanning. That's a third-party responsibility. Help Systems has a unique relationship with McAfee. I know, Sandi, your background is part of the company that Help Systems acquired. I'm not going to say many years ago. There was a few. That created that first antivirus engine for IBMI. So this is an area that we're extremely familiar with. We maintain that relationship with McAfee and actually can bring antivirus to any of the Power operating systems as well as Linux on x86. So don't look over this category. PCI has an entire requirement dedicated to this subject. And of course, we know why. So IBMI included in that discussion. It is a quick win. It's easy to do.
So user privileges, what exactly makes up a privileged user, and how do we find them?
So this is one of my favorite conversations with customers because we talk about a lot of topics that people in their minds are interpreting the user's privileges based on what we're paying them to do, not what they're actually capable of doing. So one of the first things we need to do is create a definition of what constitutes a privileged account. Now, I have my definition, and I talk about this in many of my webinars and speaking engagements, but it basically breaks down to somebody who can do things outside of the application. And I don't mean just because they have access outside of the menu. I mean somebody who has a special authority, somebody who has a lot of private authorities, somebody who works on a system that has open public permissions, which sadly is just about all of them, and has the ability to use a data tool or a command line. So there's some definition there that I've kind of wrapped around that, and I'm happy to share that if anybody's interested. But it definitely means that we have to, first of all, work to define, and then we can use the reports in the operating system. We can run some queries, or you can use tools like PowerTech Compliance Monitor in order to determine the exceptions or the inclusions to those requirements or those filters, right? It's not just about one thing or another. We want to know who these users are and then potentially monitor their use of those privileges. Cleanup tends to be a multi-phased approach. We want to get rid of the privileges that the user has no requirement for at any time. One of the most common permissions is job control. In fact, we see an average of almost 500 users on each system with job control. And a lot of times it's mentioned because people go, well, they start a print writer, they need job control. But we have to remind that job control also allows a user to say, in subsystem star all star immediate, which is not something you want Johnny the end user being able to do. So very, very important topic. We have ignored this for many years because back in the dumb terminal days, it was less relevant because we knew that the user was corralled by the menu, but now we know users can connect outside of the green screen, and when they do so, the menu's not going to help. And in some instances, even the command line restrictions don't help. So this is arguably one of the most important topics, and also what I consider one of the Achilles heels of most IBM server configurations.
So file integrity monitoring is another area that I just look at and go, wow, okay, how does this work? And does it apply to IBM?
Well, it's a term that tends to be used in reference to FIM. So you talk to somebody on the security team and talk about FIM, what they typically interpret this as is making sure that the system configuration is not changing. We've got to remember that most operating systems are file-based. So the configuration of Windows or Linux is done through configuration files. So what we're really trying to do here conceptually is just make sure that the system configuration isn't changing. Now, when there's a requirement for FIM under IBM we can still do that, but we have to do it a little bit differently. It's no longer just about monitoring database files, although that tends to be part of it. We also have to look at the system configuration, which for us is done through proprietary elements called system values. But we also have audit settings, we have exit programs, we have user profile attributes. And to me, when we look at FIM as a definition, we have to recognize that we may, in fact, have to include those things in a way that we wouldn't with other operating systems. Now, there's also the element that is in files, such as sensitive data, knowing that somebody is looking at the credit card data without actually going through the credit card application. Same thing with payroll. Who is adjusting payroll through a DFU type file utility rather than using the approved application? I don't necessarily want to know when the approved application is used because I'm going to get a lot of noise. What I want to know is when there's exceptions to the expected types of connections. And there's ways to do that under IBM through database journaling and other tools. It's just an idea that tends to be referenced in regards to server config, and we do that slightly differently.
All right, so user ID and password doesn't equal secure authentication. So where are we going to find that information for the audit?
Well, the secure authentication really, again, comes down to a bit of a concept, right? We see a lot of IBM shops that believe because the system is inside the corporate firewall that we don't have to pay the same level of attention to people who connect to the server. Reason being, they've already provided authentication to get on the network. So we know they're employees or they're valid to be there. But let's face it, IBM runs lots of different types of applications. Just because I'm an employee doesn't necessarily mean that I should have visibility to all databases under IBMI. So when we talk about secure authentication, what we have to do is treat the uniqueness of this server by making sure that people connect to it are just the appropriate ones. Now, there's some tricks and techniques that we use here. We'll hear reference in a lot of regulations now to multi-factor authentication. That's new concept to a lot of people. It's becoming more common. If you sign online to your banking website, you've probably been asked to get a code to your phone and then enter it on the website. It's becoming more and more common to do that. That's multi-factor authentication. What it's doing in essence is taking the password, which is something that's in your head and could be known by somebody around the world, and combining it with an element from a different type of category, often biometrics or a device like a phone or a key fob that presumably only you have the possession of. So by doing that, not only are we validating that the user knows the information, that they're the user that was given the information. PCI requires this now for administrative accounts that are signed on to non-console devices, which is just a fancy way of saying privileged users who are not signing on to a console. Now, again, when we talk to MFA as a topic with customers, I say to them, how many users do you need that have to use MFA? And they usually say 4 or 5, something in that realm. And I say, is that based on what? And they say, well, they're the users that are our admins. But their determination of admin is based on the job description that that user has, not based on the privileges that the profile has. So if you have users that all have all object, you could argue they are all admin level profiles. They may not be administrative personnel, but they are administrative accounts. And in that instance, then in theory, under PCI, everybody should be signing on with multi-factor authentication. Not necessarily a bad thing anyway. So some things we can do there. Single sign-on is another initiative that we talk about with authentication because it allows us to authenticate the user at one level on the network and then know who they are when they come through to the different servers, but bypass some of the traditional sign-in requirements, which means it's easier for the user. They don't have to know another password or write it down on a post-it note. So that's definitely an initiative that is very, very popular at the moment with IBMI and other operating systems. We also consider the potential of provisioning from a central repository. A lot of us use Active Directory to manage our user accounts, and we do have the ability under IBMI with some assistance from tools like PowerTech to be able to onboard a user based on them being placed into Active Directory. So there's some ways to simplify the provisioning and deprovisioning process. Regardless of whether you do any of that, however, we still want to have strong passwords. I saw, I think it was 15, 16 systems last year, Sandy, through our security scan of IBMI servers that had a password length of 1. And I tell people that and they laugh, and it's kind of a nervous laugh because everybody knows what an awful idea that is, but we still see it. So we want to talk about strong passwords, much more about the length of the password nowadays, thanks to some changes in NIST last year, than it is about some of the other rules that traditionally have made users frustrated because they can't come up with a password, right? And then last, but by no means least, making sure that all the communication between the client and the server, so your PC and the IBMI emulation server, is encrypted. So many people are using access client solutions or some iteration of, and the user ID and password is winging across the network in the clear, and that's never a good idea. So we still have people that are not dealing with regulations, right? In fact, I'm going to pop up a poll right here. Let's see how many of you are dealing with regulations. Let me open that real quick as I speak to this one. If you just want to give us some idea if you're dealing with regulations here. So the rest of us who are not dealing with regulations don't get off scot-free. We still have to recognize that there is responsibility to shareholders, to customers, to vendors. And if we're not taking the necessary steps because compliance regulations are not holding our feet to the fire, then we could potentially be exposed. So even if you are not formally audited, what we want to recognize is that there is still responsibility, and you're much better off being proactive here than reactive in leveraging those frameworks and compliance mandates voluntarily. Now, PCI is actually a pretty good one, and I say that because it's been through quite a bit of evolution, and it's also more technology-centric than perhaps something like Sarbanes-Oxley, which is more about checks and balances of financial data. So if you're looking for some types of recommendations, then PCI is a pretty good one in my opinion, right? Now, the thing is, you've got to continually reevaluate because risks do evolve. Business activities change as well. You're probably doing things in your industry today that perhaps you weren't 10, 15 years ago. And so again, having a policy or any type of framework that is outdated is not going to be beneficial. And I've mentioned it already, but high availability is not always the answer here. That works very well if you lose a hard drive or if there's a fire or an issue in your data center. But if there's an activity that is data oriented or server oriented based on the settings, then most likely it's going to replicate to the backup system. And you're going to have the scenario that some of us have never considered where both systems go down concurrently. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Looks like PCI is the most common, about 50% of you dealing with that, and then followed by HIPAA. And then we have about a third of you dealing with some other type of regulation. GDPR is not seeing anything. If you're not familiar, again, that's the European regulation that carries those hefty fines. Expect to hear more about that because we're starting to see the enactment of some regulations here in the US that look awfully like GDPR. All right, so I'm going to close out that poll. And Sandi, what I'd like to do, I know we've got about 10 minutes left here. What do you think about zipping through some examples of some of the things that we've seen in the IBMI world? Because as the publisher of IBMI Security Study, we see a lot of stuff, right?
Yep.
And share with people some of the ideas that perhaps they can chase with regards to improving their stance.
Let's do
All
it.
right. All right, so this is going to go pretty quick. I'm going to just rattle off some things here. Number one, modified IBMI profiles. An IBMI supplied or an IBM supplied profile is not something that is locked out from you. So we often see changes to these profiles in ways that perhaps are unexpected. Q programmer is now a security officer. Q user has all object. So we see lots of those types of changes, and therefore opening doors that perhaps we're not expecting. So when you're auditing your system, which I know you're all doing, right? Make sure that you are including IBM profiles in that, not excluding them because you think, well, there's nothing you can do about those profiles because somebody may have modified them. The other thing we see, and this is not just from IBM supplied profiles, but when a user profile is created, it should always be public exclude. And it is more common than not that we have at least one or two profiles, sometimes many profiles, that are set up on a system that allow public access. Now, I'm not suggesting that means you can sign on. It just means you can say run as, and that may give me access to be able to run a job with more permissions than I myself have. All object profiles tend to be very common. We see far too many of these on systems. I think there's about 160 something of these on average. And that's a pretty powerful privilege for that many users to have. So we may see it on service accounts and things, and that may be okay, but there's really no major justification for any normal user to have something like all object. And we want to make sure that once we've got that under control, that we're monitoring to see if there's any more popping up. Maybe somebody was given all object to troubleshoot a problem and we forget to take it away. So that's definitely an area that would benefit from some cleanup. Default passwords is one of the easiest things to exploit, but also one of the easiest things to fix. And what we mean by default password is where the password mirrors the name of the user account. Right? So when profiles are first created, a lot of times the administrator will use that default as the initial setting, putting it into an expired state so that when the user first signs in, they have to change it. But we're assuming then the user is going to sign in, or it's the intended user who first signs in. So we've got to be very careful here. There is a command on the system, analyze default password, that will identify which accounts have this weak password. And there is, as of 7.2 of the operating system, a way to tell the operating system that not even administrators can create a profile with a default password. All right, so easy thing to fix, but one of the most common vulnerabilities that we see. I've mentioned service accounts. Oftentimes we see those service accounts being given a lot of privileges. We're not really sure in many instances what that authority actually is that's required. But under V7R3 and now with 7.4, there is a feature called authority collection that allows us to have a better handle on what authority is actually required by a profile and allows us to therefore fine tune the permissions that they have, right? If you're not yet to 7.3, what you can do is make the service account a member of a profile that owns the application. That gives them all permission to the individual application without opening the door to all other applications and even the operating system by having all object. Now, the application segment here is one of the corners of our triangle that I mentioned earlier, but we want to make sure that as new objects are being created, that they are officially sanctioned and that they have the correct attributes assigned to them. It's very common for people to put new objects into a library. We just want to make sure that they're approved, right? So they should be going through QA and testing. We don't want people compiling directly into a production library, even if they have legitimate reason to be recompiling. And we certainly don't want people putting unauthorized objects into any library, especially those that may be involved in the operating system or above the operating system in the library list, right? And remember, hiding objects is pretty easy. If I create an object called QECY2BA and put it in the QSys library, you're going to be very nervous about deleting it because you don't know what it does. But unfortunately, you might find out later exactly what that does. We tend to see a lot of people using development partitions, and I'm excited about that. I like to see that being done away from the production data, but we also then recognize that people want to have that production data to test with. So they copy the data over, they save it, restore it, they replicate it, whatever, right? And then what we find is that the development users are not secured in the same way. And therefore, if I'm trying to hack a system, which may be very difficult in production, it suddenly becomes very easy to access that data in a test or QA environment. Granted, it might not be live data, but if I refreshed it yesterday, does it really matter? Now, there are features of the operating system, things like row column access control. We talked about encryption, that field proc option, which was born in version 7.1, can all be used in order to make sure that even though we may have production data sitting on a secondary LPAR, that we're putting the same type of attention into protecting it as we are with the original production data. Speaking of programmers, I know testing is not something that is probably their favorite activity. I actually used to enjoy doing this because I was quite good at finding things wrong. But we have to recognize that we don't want to just deploy applications without some mindset about how it's going to interact with the security infrastructure, right? We don't want to have an expectation that a user has all object special authority, even though sometimes we still see commercial apps telling their customers that. So go through testing, make sure you know the minimum amount of authority the user should actually have. And if you can, use techniques like adoption and swap profiles to eliminate the requirement for the user to be powerful, let the application be powerful. If we do have to debug a failure, I know that if it's in the middle of the night, we tend to throw all object at the problem because it does tend to fix it. But that's like putting in a finishing nail with a sledgehammer. It is overkill and then some. So what we tend to do as a short-term solution should not be our long-term solution. So what we need to do is determine the appropriate permissions, do our testing, and make sure that we reset it after we've solved the problem. Don't just use the sledgehammer to knock the hole in the wall and then say all is good. The integrated file system, very useful facility. Most of us are using it whether we know it or not, but we do see a lot of mistakes. First of all, the default public permissions for the root folder is the equivalent of public star all, which is not a good setting. So we want to change that. We also want to recognize that sharing the root folder is not typically recommended because under the root we have qsys.lib, which is where all of our native libraries, files, and programs live. And there is rarely good reason for a user to access that directory structure through a Windows drive share. So definitely an area that I would review, making sure that that root is configured correctly and making sure it's only shared in a subfolder type format. A lot of attention was paid to patching over the last couple of years because we've seen a number of instances of malware that have hit the machines in various operating systems, taking advantage of vulnerabilities that were known about and had been fixed. But because the customers had not updated their server or their code to take advantage of those patches, they were still susceptible. Now, under IBMI, we don't have quite the same patching methodology as we do with Windows, for example, but there are security PTFs that need to be on. And this is especially true if you're using things like Java or open source languages. That's definitely a procedure that you should be following, as well as to add some additional function. If you're going to take advantage of some new features, perhaps security oriented, a lot of times they are put on by PTF, and keeping current allows us to do that. I mentioned the encrypted sessions. This one is pretty straightforward, I think, conceptually. Just know IBMI is capable of talking to your PCs through an encrypted path. You don't have to buy software to do that. It's just a matter of turning it on and configuring it. In fact, on our website, we have webinars that talk about this topic exclusively. So look that up. If you want any help getting that encryption of communications done, let us know. We'll be happy to help you. I mentioned web applications, but we do see people running on IBMI, and that's great. But don't think just because they're running on IBMI, they're inherently secure. We still want to follow the best practices of configuring that HTTP server or that Java application. The fact that it's running on IBMI, it's still going to run the same application as it would on Windows. So we've still got to follow those best practices for testing and setting up the servers appropriately. So if you want, I would suggest looking to see if you have a situation where the security controls that you currently have implemented are perhaps a little lightweight based on the value of your IBMI data to your organization. So if you find that is the case, then this is definitely something that you'll want to perhaps rewind and take some steps towards securing. Now, Sandi, I zipped through that pretty fast. That may elicit some questions, of course, from people. Please feel free to use the question panel to send us those questions, and we'll be happy to answer those. While you're sending those to us, just know that Help Systems has been highly invested in IBMI security for many years. This is Robin again speaking. I represent the security product side of the house, but we also have Carol Woodbury on staff, who many of you know was the IBM security architect in IBM Rochester for many years, and she heads up a team of services personnel that can help with operating system configuration. And like I mentioned, we published the State of IBMI Security Study, so take advantage of that as a free downloadable resource as well. We do have lots of different solutions falling into different categories, ranging from intrusion detection and prevention to encryption to virus protection and even policy comparison. So take advantage of those types of solutions, as well as, again, the services side of the house. If you want to take advantage of what's built into the OS, we can do that, whether it's pen testing, whether it's remediation work, or even just us monitoring your system so you don't have to. These are all perfectly within our wheelhouse. All right, I have a call to action for people, Sandi. I'm going to let you talk to this just for a second. I'm going to look and see what questions we have here, and then we'll open up a poll for people.
Absolutely. So our call to action here is to have you look at your security and take advantage of our free security scan that we offer. Looks at 6 different areas of security on your system, includes an hour of consultation with Robin or myself, where we'll actually talk about your system and how things are looking and offer some suggestions that will help you to figure out what you need to do to get that system to a more secure state. And that planning process, you don't know what you don't know. So
Yep.
This is going to give you that insight.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this, and certainly encourage people to take advantage of it. We have done this for thousands of customers over the years, started back in 2004. I've been doing it for 10 years. I shudder to think how many of them I have done, but I still enjoy doing them. We see a lot of consistency in the vulnerabilities in IBMI configuration. So that's definitely something that that you can take advantage of. I actually had a question come up. Somebody had heard about the scan from, maybe it was because I mentioned it earlier, asking about what it entails. It's basically a piece of Windows software. You run it on your PC. It's all self-contained. We don't need access to your system. It actually goes out, interrogates the server configuration. It takes about 60 seconds or less to run, and then it returns them into a browser environment. It actually looks like the screenshot that I had hidden behind the poll here, which you'll see again in a second. So that's non-invasive. It doesn't change anything. Our role here is, of course, to help you interpret that. And so Sandi or myself or somebody else on the team will actually go through each section of that. We don't charge for the consulting time or the use of the software. And so that's a great opportunity for you to take advantage of that. And if you've done it before, but it's been a while, usually I say once a year, I would recommend that you run it again, and we can help you with that as well. All right, good deal. Well, I'm going to close that poll. What I'd like to do is just drop to the last screen here, because I know some of you will want some contact info. If you are interested in getting some more information from us, just send an email to either Sandi or myself. If you miss those email addresses, you can always go to info@helpsystems or send to info@helpsystems.com, and the recipient of that will make sure it gets channeled through to our team over here. So don't see any other questions in the list. Let me just take one last pass through. If you think of something after the fact, please feel free to send it over to us, and we'll be happy to answer that. But we appreciate you joining us. We're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Sandi, thank you for giving your expertise as well, and sharing with folks kind of what we see out there and some of the challenges around audit and compliance, and look forward to talking to you all again on an upcoming webinar. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thank you.